Nothing is more fundamental to the United States than the idea of justice. Our whole justice system, a third of our entire government bodies, is supposed to ensure that all our actions and all of our policy is supposed to be just. If there is no justice in our domestic policy, or if there is no justice in our foreign policy, not only are we showing to the world that we aren't a just nation, but we are also not upholding this idea of justice that America was founded upon. Now, what we see from the Affirmative Team's plan is that although we may be giving more aid to Egypt, we see that it may not actually have an effect, and also it's not going to be just. Now, the goal in today's debate round that I'd like to present is the idea of justice. And there are a few reasons why the Affirmative Team's plan is not just that I'll get into later. But before I do that, I'm going to first look at some burdens of proof. Now, as the Affirmative Team has the burden of proof. Basically, they have to prove certain things to show that their plan is warranted. Some of these things are they have to prove that their plan will actually address the problem, they have to prove that the problem is significant, and they also have to prove that the disadvantages don't outweigh the advantages. All of these things are the burden that the Affirmative Team has to uphold, and otherwise their plan shouldn't be passed. So I have a few specific burdens of proof that the Affirmative Team should prove in order to warrant an affirmative ballot. First of all, they have to prove that after their plan is passed, a significant amount of aid will be given. Now, the problem with this is that actually the United States has been cutting aid to Palestine recently. According to Stephen Farrell, a journalist who works for a Reuters news agency, on February 1st, 2019, quote, U.S. aid is the main agency administering U.S. foreign assistance to the Palestine territories. The agency spent $268 million on public projects in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as Palestine private sector debt payment in 2017. But there were significant cuts in all new funding through the end of June 2018, end quote. We are already cutting a significant portion of our aid to Palestine. And this ATC Act although it may be preventing a portion of that aid from getting to Palestine, it's not actually that significant because the aid is already declining. What we see is that the Affirmative Team's plan won't have an effect if they can't prove that a significant amount of aid is given. Now, my second burden of proof is that the Affirmative Team has to prove a significant number of terrorist deaths because of our aid that isn't given. Basically, the Affirmative Team's claim is that if we give aid to Palestine, they will improve their counterterror efforts. Well, the Affirmative Team has to prove that there's actually been harm from withholding aid from Palestine. There has to actually be terrorist deaths. There actually has to be a consequence of this, of the affirmative or the federal government's decision to withhold aid from Palestine through the ATCA. And if the Affirmative Team can't prove this, then we don't see a harm because there's not a significant number of people dying or a significant number of terrorist attacks as a result of the current policy. The Affirmative Team has to prove a significant harm. That is their burden. And in order to do this, they have to prove that a significant number of terrorists have killed citizens of Palestine. Now, the next burden of proof is that we have to know the number of terrorists stopped. Now, the Affirmative Team may claim that training is effective, or that military aid in Palestine is effective, or that coordination is effective. And while I would agree that all this is possibly true, what we need to see is that there's actually going to be a significant effect. It's one thing to say that the status quo is worse than the Affirmative Team, what the results of the Affirmative Team's plan. But it's another thing to see that the Affirmative Team's plan will actually have a significant effect. For example, if you look at the difference between a four-wheel drive car and a two-wheel drive car, I think we can all agree that a four-wheel drive car is superior. However, there's a reason why many people only decide to drive a two-wheel drive car instead. It's because it's sufficient for the needs that they have, and four-wheel drive cars are much more expensive and cost a lot more for gas. So what we see from this example is that the Affirmative Team's plan has to actually show that there's a significant harm or there's a significant advantage to their policy, not just that their policy is better than the status quo. So now that I've looked at that, I'm going to look at this idea of justice. Now, like I said at the beginning of my speech, justice is important in the United States. But the Affirmative Team's plan is actually in direct contradiction to this idea of justice. There are a few reasons for this. First of all is that it harms the equal application of the law. Basically, the current system has a policy, ATCA, which allows certain individuals to sue foreign entities that they believe have attacked them for terrorism. So basically, the current system is that there's a law in place that allows this. What the Affirmative Team's plan is doing is creating an exception to that law. This is not something that has been done in the past. This is not something that we've seen happen anywhere else, and the affirmative team doesn't have any plan advocates saying that this should be done with Palestine. What we see is that there's no equal application of the law because although we may be waiving it for Palestine, other countries are not going to be happy about that. This leads to a significant amount of other disadvantages. First, we have harmed U.S. image. If we don't equally uphold the law, the United States, as the protector of the free world, will be seen as a country that's hurting justice, as a country that's against justice and against equal application of the law. Now, the affirmative team may come up in their next speech and say that in foreign policy, equal application of the law is unimportant. However, while I would agree that sometimes it's impossible to equally uphold the law, what we've seen is that the the current system, the federal government has to be consistent in their foreign policy, or else other countries will see the United States as being a violator of justice. So we will harm the U.S. image. But not only that, my second disadvantage is that we will harm U.S. influence. If the other countries see that Palestine has been waived from the ATCA, they will think that the United States is not consistent in its application of the law. They will think that the United States is not actually willing to go with its policy that it's implemented, and it's just willing to make an exception every time they see that there's a need for an exception. What this means is that there's not actually, the other countries aren't going to trust the United States, and it will harm U.S. influence. Not only will it harm our image, but it will harm our influence in other countries. And lastly, the biggest disadvantage is that it will harm justice. There's a reason that the ATCA exists. The reason that it exists is justice. There are individuals who have the ability to sue foreign entities that they believe have wronged them. And if we get rid of the ATCA, this will no longer be the case. This is harming justice. But not only that, what we see from the affirmative team's plan is that if we get rid of this ATCA, also the current trials that are taking place will also be removed as well. The affirmative team mentioned a trial that happened in the past, and they said that it was unjust because it was for a former administration. But my response to this is that still there has to be justice for this as well. There has to be justice for all administrations, and the affirmative team's plan is blatantly violating this justice in the status quo. My last point I'd like to bring up is that Palestine is not actually the best, the most coordinated in the type of aid that it gets from the United States. According to Philip H. Gordon on February 28 of 2019, quote, "Even if the United States implements all these recommendations, the Palestinians would have much hard work to do themselves," end quote. What this means is that Palestine will still have to work extremely hard, and it's something that in the status quo they currently don't have the capacity to do. So in conclusion, the affirmative team's plan is not just.